So talking today specifically about applications for reinforcement and punishment. So this is basically going to cover how can you get people to do what you want them to do? How can you influence their behavior by modifying the consequences that follow behavior? Okay, so we can look at schedules of reinforcement as one potential way of influencing someone or something's behavior. So I'll encourage you to watch the video showing B.F. Skinner, who is a very prominent behavioral psychologist, and he worked extensively with pigeons and used different schedules of reinforcement to shape their behavior. So check it out. Okay, so different schedules of reinforcement. So continuous reinforcement. This is when you reinforce every single response. So let's say that I want to work with a very young child on improving your manners. Every single time that that child says please or thank you, I lavish this child with praise. Great job, good work. Oh, you're doing such an excellent job using your manners. I love it. Continuous. Every single time we see the behavior we're trying to change, we reinforce it. With intermittent reinforcements, you only reinforce sometimes, okay? So it can be on a fixed schedule where every 5th time or every 10th time a child shows a behavior, you reinforce, or it can be on a variable schedule. So maybe I'll reinforce your behavior the first time I see it happen, then I'm going to wait until the 8th time I see it happen, and then I'll reinforce it again at the 10th time, and then at the 14th time. So there's no real pattern, right? But you keep doing the behavior because you expect that at some point you're going to get reinforced for that particular behavior. So you can apply this also to things like playing a slot machine, right? That's a variable schedule of reinforcement. You keep playing because you expect that at some point your behavior will be reinforced with winning. You don't know when, but it's going to happen eventually, and that's what allows you to continue playing. So continuous reinforcement works the best when you're trying to teach a brand new behavior, okay? Trying to teach a brand new behavior, you reinforce it every single time you see that behavior. Intermittent schedules of reinforcement are best when you're trying to maintain some kind of behavior. So let's say that, I'm still working with this child on working on her manners, and I've started with continuous reinforcement. I've reinforced every single time she uses her manners. And after a few weeks of this, it seems like she's got it down. She's doing a really good job. So I dial it back a little bit, and I start using a variable schedule of reinforcement where now, maybe I tell her, great job using your manners, maybe once a day, whereas before I was doing it 25 times a day. But she continues to use her manners because she knows that at some point I am going to lavish her with praise. I am going to reinforce her particular behavior. Okay, so shaping is another way that we can influence other people's behavior. Shaping is used particularly in teaching a complex behavior. And so in looking at very complex behaviors, think about things like learning how to drive a car. That's very complex, right? A lot of steps involved, and you didn't learn how to drive a car all in one sitting. You didn't get everything down all at once, but you learned little bits and pieces of it along the way. So these bits and pieces that are kind of like the behavior that's our end goal, but not exactly like the behavior that's our end goal, these little bits and pieces are called successive approximations. Okay, so successive means that something builds on each other, right? It's basically in a series. And approximation means it's approximate. It's kind of like what we're looking for, but not exactly. And so in trying to teach someone these very complex behaviors, you would reinforce these successive approximations, these bits and pieces along the way, and eventually, after reinforcing the successive approximations, the person will get to the end goal of that very complex behavior. You can think about children trying to learn a language. So they start out with cooing sounds, right? And babbling. These are not actual words though, right? But they're kind of like words. And so as adults, we reinforce these successive approximations, and eventually the child learns to speak a language like a native speaker. Behavior modification is one particular branch of psychology that applies all of these operant conditioning techniques that we have discussed here to teach new responses to people or to reduce or eliminate maladaptive or problematic behaviors. It's also called applied behavior analysis. So a lot of times this applied behavior analysis is very, very effective in working with children who are on the autism spectrum, working with children who have intellectual disabilities, or just working with kids who have any kinds of behavior problems. So this is a very, very hot topic in the field. So if you're interested in it, there are lots and lots of career opportunities in behavior modification. Okay, so let's talk about the opposite end. Let's talk about punishment. So talking about how punishment can be effective in shaping behavior. When does it work? Okay, so punishment works when it immediately follows a behavior. This is particularly important in working with young children. So when you work with little kids and they do something that you're not crazy about, some kind of behavior that you would like to punish, and instead of addressing it right then and there, you say, oh, just wait until your mom gets home, or wait until your dad gets home. 4 hours later, the child gets punished for the infraction. Little kids don't make that connection, right? That the behavior that they did 4 hours ago is what they're getting in trouble for now. For punishment to be the most effective, it has to follow the behavior right away so that the child can draw that cause and effect. When punishment is mild rather than harsh, particularly harsh in terms of abuse or bordering on abuse, this does not create the conditions that are necessary here. It serves more to create a fearful relationship between the parent and child. And then last, when punishment is consistent. So children really crave routine, and they really crave the safety that a routine provides. And so if you really want to change a child's behavior, you have to very, very consistently punish whatever behaviors you're trying to change, and very consistently then reinforce the behaviors that you would like to see. And by doing this consistently, you're teaching the child that every single time you, let's say, talk back to me, this is going to be the punishment. That serves to shape the child's behavior. If one time you punish the child for talking back to you and the next 4 times the child gets away with it, guess what? Kids are smart. They pick up on that. The child then knows that there aren't really any consequences for my behavior, therefore there's no motivation for me to change that particular behavior. When punishment does not work, okay, so several conditions under which punishment is ineffective. When it's administered inappropriately or mindlessly. So you will see that, some people who work with small children, when the child does anything, the parent's first initial reaction is to smack the child or slap them. That's inappropriately or mindlessly administering punishment. You're not really thinking about it, you're just doing your first reaction. When the recipient responds with anxiety, fear, or rage. So when you are basically kind of out of control, when you are disciplining a child, again, when the punishment doesn't immediately follow a behavior. Punishment also is ineffective if you don't also inform the child of what they should do in the future, okay? So if your child talks back to you and you tell your child, that's unacceptable behavior, you're punished, and that's it, that doesn't really tell the child what to do instead. Maybe talking to the child and saying, okay, this is unacceptable behavior, and in the future, I would prefer if you talked out your concerns with me, or if you brought these to my attention in a more respectful way, that's a much better way to help to change the child's behavior. And lastly, a consequence that was thought to be punishment proves to be reinforcing. So this can be a tough one, especially for children who have problematic behaviors. So think about, when you were in elementary school, if there was a child in your class who was constantly getting yelled at by the teacher for his or her behavior. Sometimes, the teacher might think, oh, well, I'm yelling at this child. I'm providing this child with not really positive attention, right? I'm yelling at this child for his behavior. However, the child sees that yelling as reinforcing in that the child's getting attention. It doesn't matter if it's good attention. It just matters that the child is getting attention for that behavior. And so the teacher yelling at the child might actually be reinforcing the child's behavior problems.